The Atlantic slave trade was one of the darkest chapters in human history. For more than 3 centuries, millions of men, women, and children were torn from their homes in Africa, forced across the ocean, and condemned to lives of bondage in the Americas. It was a system built on violence, driven by greed, and sustained by empire. And yet, it was also met with resistance, resilience, and the enduring fight for freedom. This is the story of the Atlantic slave trade, its origins, its horrors, its struggles, and its end. The Atlantic slave trade did not begin overnight. It emerged out of geography, politics, and empire. In the 15th century, European powers pushed outward, searching for wealth, resources, and power. The Atlantic Ocean, once seen as a barrier, became a highway of opportunity. Portugal led the way. In the mid-1400s, Portuguese ships sailed down the West African coast, establishing fortified trading posts. At first, their goal was gold, ivory, and spices. But soon, human beings became part of that commerce. Enslaved Africans were carried across short sea routes to Portugal and Spain, where they worked in households, cities, and plantations in Madeira, the Canary Islands, and the Azores. After 1492, Spain's conquest of the Caribbean and Portugal's control of Brazil accelerated demand. Sugar, in particular, required a vast and relentless workforce. Indigenous peoples, devastated by disease and conquest, could not meet this demand, and so the enslavement of Africans became central to Europe's colonial project. Geography shaped this trade. The Atlantic's winds and currents formed a natural circuit. Trade winds blew west from Africa to the Caribbean. The Gulf Stream swept north and east, carrying ships back to Europe. This made the triangular trade not only possible, but profitable. Politics also drove the trade. As European empires grew, so too did their rivalries. Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, France, and Britain competed for dominance. Control of the slave trade meant not just profit, but power. By the 17th century, Britain and France had surpassed Iberian powers, building colonies in the Caribbean and North America. To supply them, they relied increasingly on enslaved Africans. National governments granted monopolies to powerful companies. In England, the Royal African Company became central to imperial policy. The slave trade was not simply tolerated, it was protected, encouraged, and organized at the highest levels of state. But this story was not one-sided. African rulers and states also played a part, trading and warring to capture people who would be sold to Europeans. The Atlantic slave trade cannot be understood without first looking at Africa itself. The trade was not only a European enterprise forced upon the continent, it was also shaped by African geography, politics, and power. Across West and Central Africa, powerful states emerged in the 15th and 16th centuries. Kingdoms such as Dahomey, Ashanti, Oyo, and Congo built their strength through warfare, expansion, and trade. European merchants arriving along the coast tapped into these systems of power. Captives taken in wars or raids were exchanged for European goods: muskets, gunpowder, textiles, alcohol, and manufactured wares. These new weapons, in turn, allowed African rulers to wage further wars, creating a cycle of violence that fed the trade. For those captured, the journey was brutal. Men, women, and children were bound in chains, marched hundreds of miles from inland villages to the coast. Along the way, many died from exhaustion, starvation, or violence. For survivors, the trauma of separation from family and homeland marked the beginning of an ordeal that would stretch across the Atlantic. At the African coast, captives were held in fortified trading posts, often called slave castles. Places such as Elmina in present-day Ghana or Cape Coast Castle became infamous waypoints in the trade. Inside their dark, overcrowded dungeons, people waited for weeks, or even months, until ships arrived. The geography of the African coastline itself shaped this trade. The rivers of the Gold Coast, the bights of Benin and Biafra, and the Congo Basin became key collection points. European forts dotted the shoreline, serving as warehouses of human lives, where Africans were exchanged for goods before enduring the Middle Passage. It is important to remember that the trade involved both coercion and collaboration. Some African rulers resisted the European presence, seeking to limit or regulate it, but many others actively participated, seeing the slave trade as a source of wealth and political power. This was not an equal partnership. European demand and European ships dictated the scale of the trade. Yet, African leaders were not passive victims. They negotiated, fought, and profited, even as the system they supported would devastate their societies in the long term. By the 17th century, the slave trade in Africa had become deeply entrenched. Wars and raids tore communities apart. Entire regions were destabilized. And along the coast, the great castles and forts stood as gateways to the Atlantic. For the millions who passed through their gates, there was only one direction left: out to sea, onto the waiting slave ships, and into the horror of the Middle Passage.